Came home for Thanksgiving expecting a house full of noise. The smell of my grandmother's sweet potato pie, my dad watching football too loud in the living room, my brother arguing with someone about something that didn't matter. Instead, I found my grandmother alone at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold. The rest of the house was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator hum. There was a note on the counter. My mom's handwriting. Grandma's handwriting. Grandma's having a rough week. You know how to handle her. We'll be back Sunday. Love, Mom. That was it. No phone call ahead of time. No asking if I had plans. No, is this okay with you? I had requested that entire week off from work. I'm a pediatric home health nurse, and getting a full week around Thanksgiving is almost impossible. I had plans. A trip to visit my college roommate in Denver. Flights booked since August. I stood there in the kitchen and read that note 3 times. Then I looked at my grandmother. She looked up at me with this expression I still can't fully describe, part embarrassed, part relieved, part something else. Something knowing. They left this morning, she said quietly. Your parents, your brother, and his girlfriend. A cruise. 5 days. A cruise, I repeated, out of Miami. She wrapped both hands tighter around her mug. I told them I didn't need watching. I told them that didn't need watching. I told them that. I called my mom. It went to voicemail. I called my dad. Same. I texted my brother, whose name is Kyle, and he responded 45 minutes later with a thumbs up emoji and then nothing. I cancelled my Denver trip. The flights were non-refundable. $612 gone. I didn't tell my grandmother that part. I just put my bag down, took her cold mug to the microwave and said, okay, what do you want for dinner? Her name is Winifred, but everyone calls her Freddie. She's 79 years old, and for the past 2 years, my family has treated her like she's made of tissue paper. After she had a small stroke in 2022 minor, the doctors called it, with full recovery. My parents decided she could no longer be trusted alone for more than a few hours. They moved her from her condo in Flagstaff into the spare bedroom of my parents' house in Phoenix. They took away her car keys. They spoke to her slowly and loudly in a way that made my skin crawl, like she'd lost the ability to process normal human speech along with a few days of motor function. My grandmother did not have dementia. She did not have cognitive decline. She had a stroke, she recovered, and she was sharp in a way that sometimes made me feel like I was the slow one in the room. But my family had made a story about her, and they were sticking to it. That first night, after dinner, I made her chicken tortilla soup from scratch, her favorite. We sat at the kitchen table and she asked me about work. Not in the polite, surface-level way people ask. She wanted to know specifics. She asked about a little girl I'd mentioned to her back in September, a 6-year-old with a complex heart condition who I'd been visiting 3 times a week. She had remembered the child's case details. She asked the right questions. I looked at her across the table and thought, there is nothing wrong with this woman. They treat you like you're not all there, I said. I hadn't meant to say it out loud. She didn't look surprised. She just nodded once, slowly. I know, she said. I've decided to let them. Why? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, because when people believe you don't notice things, they stop hiding them. I didn't fully understand what she meant that night. I would by the end of the week. The second day, my mum called. I answered on the first ring because I thought something might be wrong. How's Mom doing? She asked, cheerful. The sound of the ocean somewhere in the background, or maybe the ship's interior. A low, mechanical hum. She's fine, I said. She's great, actually. Is she confused at all? Sometimes the routine change gets to her. She made us both breakfast this morning and then beat me at 2 rounds of Scrabble. A pause. Well, just keep an eye on her. Don't let her do too much. She's not an invalid, I said. I tried to keep my voice even. Lily. That's my name, Lily. She said it in that tone mothers use when they think you're being naive. We know Grandma better than you do. Just trust us on this. I wanted to say a lot of things. I said, okay, Mum, have a good trip. After I hung up, my grandmother was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. She had heard everything, or at least enough. She didn't comment on it. She just held up the Scrabble box and raised one eyebrow. I lost the third game too. By the third day, my grandmother and I had fallen into something that felt less like caregiving and more like just being together. We cooked real meals. We watched old movies she loved that I'd never seen. We drove to her favorite nursery in Scottsdale because she wanted to pick up a rosemary plant and some bulbs to plant in the spring. I want to be clear about something. I was driving her car, the one my parents had taken the keys to. My grandmother had a spare set in a ceramic dish on her nightstand that nobody had thought to confiscate. She navigated the whole way there without GPS. At the nursery, she talked to one of the workers for 20 minutes about soil composition. Technical, detailed. The worker looked at her with the open admiration you give someone who genuinely knows their stuff. On the way home, my grandmother said almost casually, I had a meeting with my attorney last month. I kept my eyes on the road. Yeah, I've been making some changes. She was looking out the passenger window. I've been meaning to tell you. You don't have to tell me anything, Grandma. I want to. She turned to look at me. I want you to know so it's not a surprise later. I don't like surprises. I don't like giving them either. She didn't tell me the specifics that day. She just said she'd been rethinking things and that her attorney had helped her restructure how her assets were set up, and that she'd had some long conversations about who actually showed up for her and who showed up for other reasons. I didn't push. It wasn't why I was there. My brother called on the fourth day. I was washing dishes and my grandmother was at the kitchen table doing a crossword puzzle, so I stepped out onto the back porch to take it. Hey, how's Grandma? Kyle asked. She's fine. Great. She driving you crazy? That annoyed me more than it should have. No, we're having a good time. Right. He laughed a little. Hey, so we're thinking of extending a few extra days. There's a thing in Key West we want to check out. Is that cool? I stood on the back porch of my parents' house in Phoenix, where I had not planned to be, having already cancelled my non-refundable flight, and my brother was calling to ask if it was cool to stay on their cruise longer. I have to go back to work on Monday, I said. I can't stay past Sunday. It's just 2 extra days, Lily. Kyle, I gave up my entire vacation to be here. I didn't plan for this. I have patients on Monday. Can't you call in? I did not respond to that. Lily, come on. Grandma needs someone there. You can't just leave her alone. She's not a child, Kyle. She doesn't need. Just think about it, okay? We'll talk. He hung up. I stood outside for a long time. When I went back inside, my grandmother looked at me over her crossword. She didn't ask what happened. She just said, 11 across, to take more than your share. 8 letters. I thought about it. Entitled? She smiled and wrote it in. I called my manager that evening and asked about Monday. She was understanding. She rearranged 2 of my visits. I felt terrible about it, but I didn't know what else to do. I wasn't going to leave my grandmother alone because my brother wanted to go to Key West. The next morning, my mom called again. Kyle says you're thinking about leaving before we get back. I told Kyle I have patients on Monday. I'm a nurse, Mom. I can't just not show up. We'll be back Monday evening. That's not. I stopped, took a breath. I rearranged. I'll be here until Monday afternoon. But that's it. That's the last adjustment I can make. You know, I think you're being a little dramatic. I didn't say anything. This is family, Lily. We all make sacrifices. I cancelled a trip to Denver. $600 in flights. I've been here 5 days. Those are sacrifices, Mum. Asking me to miss work because Kyle wants to extend his vacation is not a sacrifice. That's just expecting too much. Silence. Then, we'll discuss this when we're home. I was 31 years old, standing in my parents' kitchen, and my mother had just spoken to me like I was 16 and had broken curfew. I hung up. I looked at my grandmother. She was looking back at me. Good, she said quietly. Just that. Good. The week I spent with my grandmother, I learned things I hadn't known about her. I learned that she grew up in rural Georgia, the daughter of a woman who cleaned houses and a father who worked in a paper mill. I learned that she put herself through nursing school. She'd been a nurse. And I had gone into the same field without ever knowing that, because somehow in 31 years, nobody had thought to tell me. I learned that she and my grandfather had built their life from almost nothing, and that the money my family assumed would eventually come to them had been earned in ways that involved real hardship and real sacrifice none of which my parents or my brother had ever experienced firsthand. She told me these things at night mostly, after dinner, sitting in the living room with the TV off. She was a good storyteller, unhurried. She didn't perform the stories. She just told them with the plainness of someone who has lived long enough to know that the truth doesn't need decoration. On the last evening before my family came home, she said something I've thought about almost every day since. The people who love you for you will stay, she said. The ones who are waiting on something else, you can tell. They come around more when they think the time is getting close. She paused. Your parents love me, I believe that. But they've been doing math in the back of their heads for a few years now. Your brother too. I'm not angry about it. People are what they are, but I see it. I said, I'm not here because of any of that. I know, she said. That's exactly why I wanted you to know about the changes. My family came home on a Monday afternoon, 2 days later than originally planned. My father hugged me and said, How'd it go? Like I'd been house sitting. My mother gave me a look that said we'd be revisiting the phone conversations later. Kyle breezed in with his girlfriend, dropped his luggage in the hall, and said, Grammy, how you doing? To my grandmother in a loud, slow voice. The kind he wouldn't use with any other adult on earth. My grandmother smiled pleasantly. Very well, sweetheart. How is Key West? Awesome. So great. You would have loved it. He patted her on the shoulder the way you'd pat a friendly dog. I left an hour later. My grandmother walked me out to my car. She held both my hands for a moment before I got in. Don't tell them anything I told you, she said. Not yet. I won't. And Lily. She looked at me directly, and her eyes were so clear and so sharp that I felt, not for the first time that week, like I was the one who needed looking after. Don't let them do this to you again. 3 months later, in February, my grandmother called me on a Sunday morning and asked if I could come over that afternoon. I drove to my parents' house and found my grandmother in the living room with a woman I didn't recognize. Professional-looking, mid-40s, a leather portfolio on the coffee table. My parents were there. Kyle and his girlfriend. Everyone was sitting down and no one looked particularly comfortable. The woman introduced herself as my grandmother's attorney. Her name was Helen. Freddie asked me to come today to walk everyone through some decisions she's made, Helen said. These are changes she completed in December. Everything is already in place. Today is about transparency, not signatures. My mother glanced at me like she thought this was something I'd orchestrated. I sat down and kept my face neutral. My grandmother had restructured her estate, her condo in Flagstaff, which she had never actually sold. My parents had been paying the carrying costs, believing she'd signed it over to them. But she hadn't, and the attorney explained that clearly, was now formally in a trust. The terms of the trust directed that the property would transfer to me upon her passing, along with roughly $140,000 in savings she had maintained separately in her own accounts. A separate, smaller distribution was designated for a charity she'd supported for 30 years, a nursing scholarship fund for first-generation students in rural Georgia. My parents received a specific piece of furniture, my grandfather's row-top desk, and a collection of photographs. Kyle received a savings bond that had matured to about $3,000 and a handwritten letter. The room was silent for a long moment. Mum, my father said carefully. We've been paying the HOA on the Flagstaff condo for 2 years. I know, my grandmother said. I have records of every payment. They'll be reimbursed from the estate. That's not, I mean. He stopped. He was trying to be measured and not quite managing it. I thought we understood that the condo would come to us. We had a conversation. We had a conversation where you told me what you assumed, my grandmother said quietly. I never agreed to anything. I listened, and I didn't correct you. That's my fault, and I'm correcting it now. My mother looked at me again. Did you know about this? She knew I was making changes, my grandmother said before I could answer. She didn't know the details. I told her in the car on the way to a plant nursery. A small pause. She didn't ask questions. She just took me to get my rosemary. My brother said, Grammy, this isn't, Lily didn't even really know you that well. Kyle. My grandmother's voice was gentle, but there was no flex in it. I've been in your family's house for 2 years. I know who calls me on my birthday without being reminded. I know who asks real questions when I answer and who waits for me to stop talking so they can say the next thing. I know who cancels their vacation without ever mentioning it to me, even though I found out anyway. She looked at him evenly. I know who you all are. The silence that followed was the specific kind that happens when everything has been said and there's nothing useful left to add. My brother said quietly, I need to think. His girlfriend was looking at the floor. My mother pressed her fingers to her mouth and looked out the window. My father said, Freddie, and then didn't continue. My grandmother nodded once. I know this is hard. I'm sorry for the parts that are my fault. I let assumptions build too long, but the decisions are made and they're the right ones. She folded her hands in her lap. I think we should have dinner. I told Lily she could cook. I cooked chicken tortilla soup, the same as that first night. My grandmother sat at the kitchen table while I worked, and she told me about a robin that had started nesting in the rosemary plant on the back porch, the one we'd bought at the nursery in Scottsdale. The rest of my family sat in the living room. I could hear the low murmur of my parents talking. At one point, my brother came into the kitchen, took a glass from the cabinet, filled it with water, and left without saying anything. We ate dinner together. It was uncomfortable and quiet, and not very good. Not the food was fine, but the atmosphere was the kind that sits heavy in your chest. After dinner, when I was washing dishes, my mother came and stood next to me. I'm not angry at you, she said. It cost her something to say it, I could tell. I didn't do anything, Mom. I know. She picked up a dish towel and started drying without being asked. I know you didn't. We stood there for a few minutes washing and drying, not talking. It wasn't reconciliation exactly. I'm not sure what it was. A pause, maybe. A signal that we'd find our way back to each other eventually, even if not yet. When I was leaving that night, my grandmother walked me out again. Well, she said. Well, I said. She smiled. A small, real smile, the kind she didn't perform for anyone. Rosemary's for remembrance. Did you know that? Shakespeare, I said. Ophelia says it. Your grandfather planted rosemary in every garden we ever had. She glanced back at the porch, where the little plant sat in its terracotta pot, sturdy and fragrant even in February. He said it was the only herb that smelled like something worth remembering. I hugged her for a long time. On the drive home, I passed the exit for the Denver airport and thought about how differently that week could have looked. A different city, a different trip, my grandmother alone in that house, or shuffled into some awkward arrangement that made nobody happy. I didn't feel grateful for what I was going to inherit. I want to be clear about that. The money, the condo, none of it felt like the point. What I felt, driving home on a February night with the Phoenix skyline lit up and distant, was that I had spent a week with a woman I somehow hadn't known, as well as I thought, and now I did, and she was still here. And that felt like the only thing that actually mattered. The rosemary was for remembrance. I had things worth remembering now. I've thought a lot about what that week actually was. Not the surface version, not girl gets left behind, girl gets rewarded. That's not the story. That's just the part that's easy to summarize. The real thing that happened that Thanksgiving was simpler and harder to explain. I spent 7 days paying actual attention to a person my family had quietly decided didn't need attention anymore. And in doing that, not as a strategy, not because I expected anything, I found out who she was. Who I was, maybe. What it looks like when someone just shows up and means it. My grandmother Freddie spent 2 years letting people underestimate her. She told me herself. When people think you don't notice things, they stop hiding them. That's not passivity. That's a kind of intelligence I didn't have a word for until I watched her use it. She saw everything. She remembered everything. And when the time came, she made decisions that reflected exactly what she'd observed. There's something in that I keep coming back to. The people in my family who assumed they knew what she needed, who spoke to her slowly and checked her car keys and made plans around her limitations. They weren't cruel people. They were just incurious. They had stopped asking real questions a long time ago and they had filled the space with assumptions. And assumptions, left long enough, start to feel like facts. I almost did the same thing. I almost went to Denver. I almost let someone else handle it. Let the week pass. Let my grandmother sit at that kitchen table alone because it wasn't convenient for me to be there. The only reason I didn't was because something in me, stubbornness maybe, or just the specific training that comes from working with sick children who can't advocate for themselves, said, "You don't leave people alone because it's inconvenient to stay." That instinct didn't come from nowhere. It came from choices I made over years about what kind of person I wanted to be in, moments that felt small. You don't build character in the big dramatic moments. You build it in the Tuesday moments. The moments when no one is watching and it would be so easy to just go. The things that came to me from my grandmother's estate, the condo, the money. I won't pretend those don't matter. They matter. They've changed what's possible for me in real practical ways. That's not what I think about when I think about that week. What I think about is the third game of Scrabble, which I also lost. I think about her telling me she'd been a nurse, and the specific feeling of realizing I'd spent 31 years not knowing that. I think about driving to the nursery in Scottsdale with the spare keys nobody had thought to take, and watching her talk soil composition with a stranger, like it was the most natural thing in the world. My brother Kyle got a letter. He hasn't told me what was in it, and I haven't asked. I think whatever she wrote was meant for him specifically, and I think she put more care into it than he expected. That's who she was. Even the hardest thing she did with her hands open, not closed. I think about what she said the last night before everyone came home, that the people who love you for you will stay, that the ones waiting on something else, you can tell. She wasn't bitter when she said it. She wasn't performing wisdom. She was just telling me what she'd observed, the way she told me everything that week, plainly, without decoration, trusting me to do something useful with it. The rosemary is still on my back porch now. I moved it when I eventually moved. It's in a bigger pot. It's doing fine.